How may I help you, my brother?
Look, I'm here because I can't stand what's happening in this community.
Yes!
Yeah, and somebody has to make a change.
Yes!
Now, brother, will you help me?
Yes! Well!
Here comes Grim.
There's a certain liberty in realising that nothing that you say or do can possibly make anything any worse for you, and may in fact make things a little better for you. So with that fully in mind, let's talk about race and gaming. And here I'm specifically talking about tabletop gaming, card games, board games, role-playing games, analog gaming, if you will, though many of these now come with digital companion apps, and I'm already getting off track. But some people I'm going to take to calling Ricks, I think, due to the problems inherent in using the other terms that were used for them. I think Rick will be a hardy perennial term to use. We seem to have a lot of Ricks who seem to think that tabletop gaming has been racist, sexist, homophobic, whatever else you care to mention since its inception, and this is the reason that a lot of people don't play it, right? I don't think that's true. I know the community has always been very accommodating and even eager, possibly over-eager, to have people who are members of minorities in it. Gamers are pretty evangelical people, really, when it comes down to it. So this completely jars with my experience and the experience of just about everyone I've ever met in gaming on 2 continents and a couple of islands, and who I've communicated with down the years. It just doesn't fit. So how do we reconcile these things, and how might you actually get more people who are members of minorities into gaming? I think part of the problem is that Ricks want to be part of some kind of meaningful change or revolution, even if it's only within a subculture, right? So that they want to feel that they have won a significant and meaningful civil rights battle, even though it's already been won. I think that's part of the problem. There's also the problem that has led to the use of the term regressive left to describe Ricks, though that term has become associated with the intellectual dark web and hence the right and so on. But what it was originally conceived to mean by Majid Nawaz was people who had concern over a minority but weren't concerned over a minority within that minority. So, big illustrative problem there is that there have been pushes to have LGBT inclusive lessons in schools here in the UK. Fantastic, wonderful. Kids should know that they're not freaks if that's the way they find themselves becoming inclined, as they eventually enter puberty. And also they should understand that if a classmate has 2 mums or 2 dads, that shouldn't be anything to be worried about, right? All good, fine, dandy, except that the Muslim community in the UK is extremely conservative and don't want these lessons and have had protests and so on. So you have 2 minorities clashing, right? So you've got a racial and religious minority on the one hand and a sexual minority in the other, and their needs are incompatible, and whose side do you take in that instance? And what happens to gay Muslims and progressive Muslims in that situation? And they tend to get thrown under the bus for whatever reason. Yeah, that's the problem that describes the regressive left. So, coming back to gaming again, why is it that if gaming has always been so open and accepting and wonderful, why is it that it isn't more diverse? Why has it traditionally been seen as white and male and middle class and all the rest of it? Though I would say, at least since I first started gaming, there's always been a plentiful gay contingent, and it's hard to judge because the numbers are so small, but certainly from the very first conventions I went to in the early 90s, there were plenty of trans people around. what constitutes plenty is hard to tell. But racial minorities were always harder to find. So why is that? If games have always been like that, why haven't there always been more minorities within gaming, and why did it have this reputation and this image as a white male middle class thing? Well, I think historically it's because when D&D really took off in the mid-70s, right the way through the 80s really, it was as a game that appealed to people at university or at college. Right, people are away from home, plenty of free time, and it was a nerdy, educated pursuit. You know, it involved mathematics and English skills and planning and preparation, and it took time, and it was a hobby, right? And it was severely geeky, to the point where it would appeal to those people who were in higher learning for mathematics or for English, you know, those kind of things. And for historical reasons, for demographic reasons, and so on, that meant predominantly white and male, and so that was the vanguard of the hobby, always, right? And that was the friendship groups, because who do you recruit into gaming? Your friends. Who are the people you mix with? Who are the people around you? So that's why, I think. So the problem isn't that the games have been exclusionary or haven't included women or gay characters since pretty early on, or black characters since pretty early on. That's not the issue, I think. It's one that boils down to wealth and class, like so many other things do. And in America, it's kind of understandable why people continue to confuse wealth and class and race, because the Venn diagrams overlap a great deal for various historical reasons. Also, though to a lesser extent in places like the UK, because when you immigrate into a country, generally you're at the bottom rung of society, and social mobility isn't that great either in the US or the UK. So you're not going to see a massive swing of essentially more people from ethnic minorities and so on going into higher education, especially as there's now a price barrier to all of that. So the root cause for me is not that there aren't or have never been enough female faces, black faces, whatever, in this material. A large part of it is down to education, which comes down to wealth and class. So how do you deal with the problem? Well, this is, well, whether you think it's a problem or not is one thing, but let's assume that we want to get more racial or ethnic minorities into gaming. This isn't something I think you can solve within the games. Yeah, the community has always been welcoming, it's always been evangelical, and it's always been super keen to have anyone game. And so long as all that mattered was that you had dice, you were ready to play, that's what made it open. And paradoxically, making everything constantly about race, about gender, about sexuality, about whether you're trans or not, has, I think, had the inverse effect to the one that the agitators and activists wanted. Because now you see a new woman that you're unfamiliar with, you see a new black person that you're unfamiliar with, or brown person, or whatever, or you see someone who's an unfortunately non-passing trans person at a convention at your table. You're worried, are they going to be one of these asshole activists, or are they going to be, like used to happen, just someone who's there to play and that's all that matters? By shifting the focus away from the game, they've ironically made everything much less welcoming. It's like by bringing in all these safety tools and anti-harassment tools, they've actually increased the harassment, and they've made conventions and so on less safe for people. Yeah, they're good intentions. I honestly believe that most of these people have good intentions, but the highway to Hades is tarmacked with those, isn't it? So the only way you're really going to change it is either by changing the image, or changing the topics, or investing back into society. And this is where this regressive left part comes in, where the Ricks fail to understand that there is a lot of prejudice within minority communities against various things. There is a vicious amount of anti-intellectualism, for example, in the African American or over here the Anglo-West Indian communities. There also is within the white working class, but we don't talk about that so much. And I think it's more to do with working class than anything else necessarily. In the US it's slightly different because the racial dynamics are slightly different. But if something is seen as being for nerdy white boys, then it's just not cool. If you think about it in terms of the music scene, how many black punks do you see? How many black metal fans do you see? That's black metal fans, not black metal fans. Yeah, not many, and those who are into it often get a lot of judgment from their own communities. It's like we don't talk about homophobia in the African American and Caribbean communities, and yet it's rife. And then Asian communities, you get I think a lot more Asians in gaming, whether South Asians or East Asians. But there's a certain amount of prejudice there as well, generally coming from the parents, that this is a frivolous waste of time and they shouldn't be doing it, they should be focusing on their studies and so on. These are all stereotypes. I recognise that. They're often racist, but that doesn't mean there isn't even the slightest bit of truth to any of them. And I think most people in these communities would agree that there's issues with anti-intellectualism and homophobia and hobbies not necessarily being seen as being a good thing, though I think that's entirely wrong. So, how do you deal with it? We had a massive influx of women during the 90s, and that was largely because of a subject matter change, really, more than anything else. And games being seen as a more serious artistic pursuit. And then you had games like Vampire and so on, where combat was de-emphasized, story was emphasized, LARP became a lot more popular, but in terms of salon LARP, so you weren't actually hitting each other and so on. I think a lot of these factors, and the fact that gaming kind of became cool within the goth alternative scene, that's what drove that uptick in women participating in gaming. So how would you get more ethnic minorities involved in gaming? I think you would have to find the things that appeal to them. And I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole with a halfling tied at the end for fear of being called stereotypical or whatever. But let's talk about the white working class in the UK instead, shall we, as a kind of proxy, because they don't game. What might get them gaming? If you did a tabletop game that was low math, low English, very simple, had a graspable mechanic that didn't feel very nerdy to them, and which replicated something like Grand Theft Auto, perhaps, then you might get some interest. If you did a soccer, football RPG, that might elicit some interest. But putting white working class characters into games wouldn't nudge the needle at all. It wouldn't get you more white working class players. You'd have to be visible to them. You'd have to have games that appeal to their interests. Representation doesn't do it. You know, if you're represented in something that you're not interested in, it makes no difference to you. But if you could play out your fantasy, perhaps, of being a very wealthy, skillful footballer on the world stage, that might appeal to someone. Or if you could play out your fantasy of being a big-time gangster, right, that might appeal to you. Or a rock star or a pop star, yeah, something like that. That's where I think you might get more participation from that community. So rolling this all back to ethnic minorities, yeah, it's funny how things come together and sort of coalesce, isn't it? I've mentioned this before, but Mike Pondsmith, right? To me, he is the model, the example of how to be a successful person of colour in gaming, because it's absolutely meaningless that he is. No one cared. Of course, not a lot of people knew necessarily back in the day, but it didn't matter. It didn't make any difference. No one bought Cyberpunk because the maker was black, right? They bought it because it was a good game. CD Projekt Red picked it up because it was a good game, not because Mike Pondsmith is black. Yeah, and he's had little or no patience for the identity politics fired his way, and it's great that CDPR have put him kind of front and centre, and they've involved him in everything, and they've had him running demos and doing interviews and talking to people, and good on Mike, because he fucking deserves it, right? That's the model. Mike Pondsmith is the Uncle Phil of gaming, right?
You got yourself a game.
Jeffrey? Break out, Lucille.
That's the kind of role model you want. What you don't want is a grifter. What you don't want is Hooper X.
Now, my book. White-hating coon? Don't have none of that bullshit.
And that's where I'm at, I guess. I want people to be Uncle Phil. I don't want them to be Hooper X. And I don't think that is how you push the needle in terms of diversity and participation. I think you do that by making the kind of things that people might be interested in, not a kind of facile, surface level representation. You know, a Polynesian face on page 372 of your player's guide isn't suddenly going to create a massive influx of Maori players for your game, right? Making something that they're interested in the first place is. Zang.
It's time for you boys to share my last taste of the true black meat. Flesh of the giant aquatic Brazilian centipede.
Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin in Illinois. This poor white trash went on to become the President of the United States. Once in office, this